If you're just joining us, we welcome you to Mind Matters, the community mental health education event for NAMI Central Texas. Our event today is generously sponsored by Ascension Seton, and we are so grateful for their support. Again, my name is Dr. Rebecca Farrell. I'm the Program and Outreach Director here at NAMI Central Texas. We are excited to have you here with us today as we learn about how family dynamics intersect with addiction and recovery. We are joined by Dr. Ali DeGraaf from the Right Step Hill Country and Promise Behavioral Health. Welcome, Dr. Ali. I'll turn it over to you for an introduction and presentation.
Morning. Thank you, Rebecca and Aaron, for having me in NAMI Central Texas. I am very excited to be here. I'm going to get started on my screen share. Give me just a second. All right, so yeah, my name is Dr. Ali DeGraaf. I am the Director of Clinical Operations at the Right Step Hill Country, which is a Promises Behavioral Health facility. I'm so grateful to be here. Rebecca, Aaron, Julie Moss, thank you for being the connector, and all my therapy team from the Right Step is here. So I'm glad that I get to be here with all of you today, and I'm super excited to talk about family dynamics of addiction and recovery. This is my specialty. I studied this in undergrad and in grad school. And I know a lot of therapists and family members all are very curious about what this is. I've done this work with families for many years. And so I've tried to adapt this for both the family members in the room, for those individuals that are struggling with substance use themselves, and as well as clinicians trying to learn about family dynamics and how these parts intersect. So like Rebecca said, I'm going to try to manage the chat. So if you have questions during the presentation, please do put them in the chat and I will try to address them as they come up. I prefer to have more of a dialogue interaction, but I know in webinars it's kind of difficult, especially with, like Rebecca said, almost 300 people. So let's go ahead and get started. All right. So what we're going to be talking about today is family dynamics of addiction and recovery. I like to get started with just a brief overview. Almost 99% of the time when I'm working with family members, the first thing that they want to hear from me is about, why is my loved one an addict? What caused this? How did this happen? So I'm going to just briefly kind of talk about that and speak to that. And then I'm going to dive into defining the family as a system. And I'm going to review some very common family dynamics. Now, family dynamics, people get PhDs in this subject. So what I've done is I've picked out kind of 5 dynamics that I think are really relevant to the intersections of addiction, recovery, and family work. And those are going to be interactional processes, communication processes, family roles, the progressive cycle, and then a developmental trajectory, which kind of puts all of this on somewhat of a timeline. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that, you'll be an expert in family dynamics after that, and I'm going to talk about how these dynamics apply to recovery, and I'm going to give you some solution. Side note, not 100% of the time, but a lot of the time, you can take the word addiction in this presentation and interchange it with mental illness. Like I said, it's not always, but it can be helpful to think about if you are also a clinician or a family member with working with someone with mental illness. A lot of recovery concepts apply to mental illness as well. So just something for you to think about. So before we dive in, I want to give you an invitation and maybe just a practice. Raven, thank you. Tell Casey I said hello. He's a good friend of mine. I have this little image up on the screen, and I want to just invite you to take a minute and look at it and kind of make sense. I know it's a little pixelated, but what this looks like is maybe a little mountain with some snow and ice on it. And I'm going to give you an invitation to, instead of just seeing this mountain, I want you to try to zoom out and gain some perspective. So I'm going to ask you to put your zoomed out glasses on. And through this presentation, I'm going to ask you to challenge your assumptions of addiction, mental illness, and recovery, and try to see a bigger picture. It's not the bigger picture, it's not the biggest picture, but it is just a different perspective on what we know about, or what a lot of people know or assume about addiction and recovery. So let's get started. Let's dive in. So like I promised, family members and folks that struggle with addiction and mental illness, the first thing that they ask when I get them in a room is, why is my loved one an addict? How did I become an addict? How do you know it's addiction? And so I just like to kind of say there is not one thing that leads to addiction, but we do know that there are a number of factors that have been identified for risk for addiction. So we have biological, psychological, and social and environmental factors that basically define someone's risk for addiction. So number one is biological, genetic factors. You guys have probably all heard of the addiction gene. While there's not one addiction gene, we know that people's genetics, even in the same family, present differently, right? I have a brother who's got darker skin and he's way taller and he's a big dude, right? He's got black hair, he doesn't look like me, we have the same genes. And so the same thing happens in addiction, right? You can have people with the same biological composition, but they express themselves differently. And we do know that there is a genetic vulnerability for addiction. The second part is the psychological factors that affect risk for addiction. These two are going to be your personality factors, right? Risk-taking, tolerance, impulsivity, perfectionism. We have mental health factors in this category, such as anxiety, depression, ADHD, bipolar disorders. And then we also put trauma and abuse factors in here because we know that people that go through traumatic experiences, their brain, the chemistry of their brain, it looks different. And so again, you can do a whole PhD and dissertation on this, but I do like to say that psychological factors do present risk for addiction. The last part that I like to think about is social and environmental aspects, family attitudes, history of drug use, which we'll get into a little more, ease of accessibility to drugs and alcohol in the environment. And then we know that humans are social beings. So if our social groups are doing one thing, we like to fit in. That's normal. And so we often will adopt those behaviors. So if our community has high rates of use, it's likely that, you know, the people in that community will be users. And then the last part is media. We know that the media glorifies often drug use and alcohol use, and that can impact folks' vulnerability and risk to addiction as well. So what I like to kind of say to wrap up this slide is there is no way to work with somebody and say, for sure, like you are 100% an addict or alcoholic because of your psychological history. For each person, it's going to likely be some combination of the three. But what I like to then work with family members towards understanding is that the etiology of the addiction is actually not as important, because if you think about it, no matter where it comes from, the solution is the same. I have a whole nother presentation on just this slide, but we do have treatment for biological vulnerabilities, we have treatment for psychological, and we have treatment for social and environmental. And so I'll go through a recovery plan with you later, but yeah, I like to just kind of situate that and get us focused on solution and understanding a little bit more about addiction and recovery dynamics. So all of that being said, let me go back. I want to start by orienting what the family is. I want to orient it as a system with multiple parts. And so if you think of a family, you have individuals, those are the parts, and then you have the whole, which us therapists like to say the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, which means that if you've got, these little puzzle pieces of these little kid hands, they're all holding a piece of paper. Individually, that piece of paper is one thing, but when you put it together, it creates a image of a fish-looking kind of image. And so together, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts because you can see that whole. The family is the same. One of my teachers in undergrad said, if you think about it like a body, right, you've got a liver and a heart and kidneys and your skin. And if any one of those organs fails, then the body is not functioning in the way that it could be. And we think about the family in the same way. The next part about families is that we always try to maintain homeostasis in our family. And if you think about homeostasis, what that is, it's just the status quo. It's our comfortable temperature. In my house, we like to keep the temperature at 70 degrees. And so if you come in and you turn it up, we're all going to be sweating and we're going to try to do whatever we can to get the temperature to go back down. And families use their family dynamics to maintain this status quo or this temperature. You can think about it as the thermostat, right? If it gets too hot, the thermostat kicks on the AC to turn the temperature down. If it gets too cold, it turns on the heat and turns it up. Families operate in a very similar way. And when we get into dynamics, that's the AC and the heater. And then the last part about families is that they are always changing. And so when we think about how do families do change, that's where we start to learn about family dynamics. The dynamics are the processes in which we do change or resist change. All right, I'm going to keep on going. One key point that I want to make is that people don't develop problems in isolation, but it is rather a response to a biopsychosocial environment, like my first slide. And so what we do as therapists is we study problem behaviors in the social unit, and therefore we emphasize that recovery should be emphasized on the social unit, not just in the one person. Side note, I'll talk a lot about the family in this presentation, but sometimes family is not an option for everyone. So you can also learn and develop these recovery dynamics within chosen family, your community, and your own sober social support groups. So when you hear me say family, know that my definition of family is kind of broad. All right, so now we're going to dive into these specific dynamics of interactional processes, communication, progressive cycle, family roles, and family development dynamics. And again, you could do a dissertation on all of these. So this is just going to be an introduction to what these are. And that way we can talk about recovery in the context of that. All right, so number one, we have interactional processes. So these are some dynamics that are implicit, unspoken, things that all families do to negotiate and navigate change. While each family is very unique, we do see a lot of common dynamics. And so the first one is going to be differentiation of self. Well, let me go back. I want to talk about family dynamics as it relates to interactional processes as rules that are, again, not spoken, but they are accepted as reality. Often they go unquestioned and they hold a great deal of power in the family's day-to-day interactions. So these are things that are often unknown, unseen. We don't think about them, we just participate in them. So number one is differentiation of self. So this is basically a high level description would be that when a person is highly differentiated, they are able to have their own thoughts and feelings independent of the family system. And so you can think about it as if you're not highly differentiated, then you're kind of vulnerable to groupthink. And so people with a poorly differentiated self will rely heavily on the acceptance and approval of others. And you see low differentiation of self often in families with addiction. So that's high level overview of differentiation of self. And I'll get kind of more into these a little bit later on. The second dynamic that we do is triangulation. So a triangle is a 3-person relationship system, and it is kind of the building block or the smallest molecule of the family, because the triangle is the smallest, most stable relationship system. So what happens is, if I am in conflict with my partner and there's tension between us, we need to relieve that tension. So what we're going to do is we're going to loop in or suck in our child, and we're going to somehow share the conflict with them. This is a very common pattern in families with addiction. And I'll say this again at the end of the slide, but it's not necessarily a bad thing, triangulation, because if two people have conflict, they need to have a way to release that tension. What happens is, when triangles get stuck and we're constantly going to our kid to relieve our tension, then we begin to see dysfunctional family dynamics become entrenched. So that's what a triangle is. Multi-generational transmission process. This is a very fancy way of saying that we pass down from generation to generation norms and expectations that either increase our risk for addiction in the family or decrease our risk. And so it can be very small things, such as you don't go to sleep with your shoes under your bed, or very big things like we do not talk about taboo topics like addiction or sex or money. So the multi-generational transmission is just another dynamic that kind of influences our risk or vulnerability for addiction. Emotional cutoff. I went back and forth on including this one, but I wanted to just kind of, I eventually just decided to keep it, because what we do with emotional cutoff is very common in addiction in families, because what happens is the anxiety and the tension gets so intense that people just decide, like, cut it off. I'm done with it. And while on the surface level, that can maybe feel like it's providing some relief, what we do is we create unresolved conflict patterns in the family. We don't ever actually address the issue. We just kind of cut it off and put it under the rug. And so that is another very common dynamic in addicted families with addiction, sorry. Second to last is hierarchy and power. This one is kind of straightforward when you think about, hierarchy and power is normal in families. You've got parents in the hierarchy and kids in the kind of subsystem. The parents have the power. But when you think about in families with addiction, typically the addiction or the mental illness is what holds the power, and the family organizes around that. And so this is another one that I just like to make really explicit, because I think people don't think about that. I realized I skipped boundaries, so I'm going to go back up to that one. So boundaries are basically just the limits that families set with each other. The kind of range of boundaries goes from disengaged to enmeshed, or very rigid to very diffuse. And what we kind of describe as healthy boundaries are clear and flexible. And so, again, boundaries are just unspoken ways that we kind of navigate change or resist change. And then the last one is coalitions and alignments. These are very common in families. And, if you think about, like, parents need to be aligned in their goals for working hard and, creating a college savings for their kids, if that's their goal. But what we find in families with addiction is coalitions or alignments that people are teaming up against the one person, or they are, colluding behind their back. And so noticing these coalitions and alignments and kind of making them explicit. And when you're trying to understand the family dynamics in your own family can be very helpful. So that's what interactional processes are. The next part is that, yeah, I've said these dynamics serve to maintain the comfortable temperature, and they are often unspoken. We don't think about them. So I just like to talk about them, make them explicit, so that way people know that they go on. And I want to say on these don't necessarily mean dysfunctional or healthy. There's really kind of no value assignment to them. They're just processes that we like to take from the unspoken category, make them explicit, and then kind of work with families on noticing when those happen so we can change them as needed. All right, the next is communication. Again, you could do a whole PhD on communication, but I wanted to present to you some common dynamics that we see in families with addiction. So in active addiction, we've got 3 unspoken rules that families adhere to. Don't feel, don't talk, and don't trust. And then we have 3 common beliefs that family members hold around the addiction, which is I caused it, I can control it, and I can cure it. And then we have 3 good faith communication attempts that I see a lot in families. Number 1 is we, as family members, try to lecture or explain away what's going on to either our loved one suffering with addiction or to our friends or people in the outside the system. We like to also use you statements, which, you know, you feel sad and that's why you use, and you did not show up to family therapy, and that means you don't love me. So we like to do a lot of you statements in active addiction. And then my favorite is the review of the receipts. When I have family members in my therapy room and they start to do this, I just say, like, I don't want to review the receipts, because what they do is, well, do you remember that one time that you showed up high to Christmas and then your grandma got upset and then you ruined Christmas? And that wasn't unrelated to that one time that you showed up to, you know, the hospital and we all had to go there and we thought you were dead. And so reviewing receipts is actually not helpful. So these are kind of some common communication dynamics that we see in active addiction. And then I wanted to just kind of I'm jumping ahead of myself, but in active recovery, it's kind of the opposite, right? We talk about unspoken rules and breaking those, doing the opposite. Do recognize and feel your feelings, and do talk about those emotions and trust the process of recovery. And then changing those unhelpful beliefs of family members that you did not cause it, you cannot control it, and you cannot cure it, no matter what your brain tells you. And then we flip those communication attempts in active addiction, and in recovery, we teach people how to listen and empathize, use I statements, and express your emotions, so that way you're increasing connection. Because when you lecture or explain away, you're just distancing yourself from your loved one. And so when we're able to express our emotions that are universal, we're actually inviting people to start to connect. Yeah, thank you, Angie. She says, an unspoken rule of her home is don't believe anything you hear and only half of what you see. That's a good one. That's very insightful. So that's communication dynamics. The next dynamic that I want to talk about is our progressive cycle of addiction. A lot of people freak out when I put this on the screen. They see the word fatal, but I do like to just say, I'll get further into this, but the addiction cycle is fatal if it is left untreated. And that is kind of the reality that we're facing in our society right now. Overdose rates are through the roof, people needing to go to treatment at higher rates. And so the way that we think about addiction is that it is progressive if left untreated. And so what I want to invite all of you to do is kind of participate along with me. I'm going to walk through first how addiction looks for someone that is actively struggling with addiction, and follow through this process. So first thing is that people suffering with addiction, number one, it becomes primary for them. It becomes the first thing that they think about in the morning. They plan their day around how they're going to use and get away with it. And that's kind of phase number one. Phase number two is that it continues to become progressive and it gets worse and worse. So people are continuing to use despite negative consequences, which is the key indicator for a substance use disorder diagnosis. So they're choosing to use over work, and then they choose to use over family, and then they're using despite, legal consequences. So it continues to get worse and worse. The third phase is that it starts to become predictable. So you know that Scott's going to be drunk and high at every family holiday and make a scene. And we just kind of know that that's what's going to happen on Christmas. It becomes predictable, and then it becomes chronic, and it exists for a long time and becomes recurring. So if left unmanaged, it becomes the manager. Just like any other disease, addiction is chronic and needs managing. And if left untreated, it will become fatal. And I like to talk about fatality as not just the death of a person's body, but in many ways, goals, dreams, relationships, hopes, love starts to die off, right? So this is what happens for a person that uses substances, is chemically dependent, or some people prefer, alcoholic addict. Now I'm going to put these on top of our progressive cycle of addiction, and I'm going to outline the ways in which family members go through the same exact cycle. So us family members, our loved ones using becomes the first thing that we think about, and we plan our day around it. It becomes progressive, and we're obsessing over it. We're trying harder and harder to control it. We're going to new lengths to try to control the person's substance use, protect them, right? From whatever consequences. It becomes predictable for us too. You cannot talk about that around them. And if we do, we know what happens. Or you cannot ask them to not drink at Christmas. So for us, our own ways of interacting with the addiction in the family becomes predictable. It becomes chronic for us because we let go of all of our life to some extent, and we too become managed by the addiction. And when we try to manage it and control it so hard, it actually starts to control us. And again, for us family members, it also becomes fatal for our dreams, our goals, our relationships. And so this is one way of kind of thinking about it as a progressive cycle through time. And my point here is that I want to elaborate on that we as family members, even if you're not an active substance user, we go through the same exact cycle. Yes, Gilbert shared in his family's active addiction, he has 4 S's: silent, secret, shame, and script. Perfect. I love that. That is very common as well. All right. So our next family dynamic that I want to cover are roles. And there's a lot of literature out here on roles, so I'm not going to get into this one in depth. But we see family members get into these roles, and when there is an active addiction in the family, they get stuck in these roles. So we have our victim addict. The whole family is centered around them. We have an enabler, sometimes the caretaker, they're super responsible. We have our hero, which is going to legitimize the family and provide goodness to the system. We have our scapegoat that's often the distraction, gets blamed for the problems, and yeah, is it just a distraction from the real problem in the family? We have our lost child, or the middle child, sometimes people call it. They stay out of the way. They don't get any attention or love, whether it's positive or negative. And then we see mascots emerge. And so these are going to be the people that use the comedy to relieve the tension in the family. What I want to say about roles is that in active addiction, people get stuck in these roles. And that is what becomes dysfunctional. It's that if the enabler tries to step out of the enabling role, the family becomes chaotic and no one knows how to react because this person has filled this role for so long. The family can't adapt. So yeah, this is family roles, and just another kind of unspoken way in which families try to maintain that comfortable temperature. So before I go to the next one, I want to make the point that just like people that are experiencing substance use disorders must find recovery before the addiction becomes fatal, family members must also develop their own recovery program. I don't know if you could tell that that's where I've been going with this. That's my thesis. But if you think, people that think in this family systems approach that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, we're implying that individual recovery, while amazing, it needs to be strengthened by family participation and support. And my teacher, Dr. Sterling Shumway at Texas Tech, used this metaphor, like wooden matches. It's more difficult to break 10 of them banded together than it is to break one of them on their own. So keep that in mind, family members. Your own recovery plan, we'll discuss what that is and what that looks like in a couple slides, but I just want to make my thesis explicit at this point. All right, so the last dynamic that I want to just make explicit is our developmental model of recovery. And this is almost like kind of like the progressive cycle, but it's orienting people in almost like a time kind of axis. And I've outlined the first row as the individual with substance use development, the individual with substance use, their developmental trajectory, and then the family system's developmental trajectory. So in active addiction, you can see that substance use is our central organizing principle. Things are tight, rigid. People can't jump out of their roles, and we're all following the rules, and we're not talking about it. And in the family system, before rock bottom, the family system begins to collapse. And the family feels that. So they tighten those defenses. They try to control more. They try to cure, and they try to manage the addiction. Whatever they can do to manage it, they're doing it. They're grasping at straws, right? And then we have the experience of rock bottom. And that is when the family system fully collapses and there becomes a vacuum in the system. This is often traumatic for people in recovery, or people suffering from substance use disorder, and for their families. And so people start to shift to external support because they realize they're kind of desperate enough that they know that they need help. And then we're moving into early recovery, where the family system begins to reorganize around recovery principles. Family members are living parallel recovery lives focused on their own recovery. And we are setting the foundation for a new system and new, healthier dynamics in our family system. And then when you get into the ongoing recovery phase, things start to stabilize, people become more differentiated, the system becomes organized by these recovery principles, and people start to experience the capacity for their own self-focus, which then contributes positively to the system, right? So this is a book called The Alcoholic Family in Recovery, a Developmental Model. by Brown and Lewis. It is a dense academic read, but if you are interested in this, I highly recommend it. It really kind of helped me organize how I think of recovery in a trajectory kind of way. All right, so we've covered interactional processes, we've covered family roles, communication, the progressive cycle, and then our developmental trajectory. And so I'm going to start to shift our conversation towards dynamics of recovery. So like we talked about, in addiction, things are stuck and rigid and unchangeable and unresolved. We don't talk, we don't feel, we don't trust. Our goal as family members is to tell and control and cure. We think that it's the addict and alcoholic's fault and they're the ones that need help in recovery. And again, we're just centralized around the addiction. The addiction holds the power. And then when we move into recovery, we start to experience flexible and clear boundaries. We develop interdependence, which means we're connected, but we're not codependent on each other, and we are collaborative. Things are changeable, or we can negotiate them because we're talking about them. We're focused on I statements, we're connected, and we have recovery plans for all family members. So again, family dynamics are just the unspoken rules and things that we do to maintain a family system or resist change. And so these are things that now you are experts on. You know that these unspoken common ways of being, and now you've made them explicit and you recognize them. So what do we do now? That's where family members are like, okay, I know all these things now, so what do I do? So I want to just provide some solution. I want to give a disclaimer though. This is highly individualized work. So I'm going to show you some common things that work for a lot of people, but for family members trying to find their own recovery, it is very individualized. And I highly encourage people to work with therapists and like the 12-step community or refuge recovery and psychiatrists, addictionologists. I encourage people to work with their support network to figure out what works best for them. But my favorite common solutions. Number one, I want to orient solution as a process and not an outcome. So going slow is very important. Too much change too fast can rock the system in a way that can actually be harmful and dangerous. So going slow means there's going to be a lot of emotions that come with the change. So give yourself the space and time to process those emotions, communicate them, connect over them. Another common dynamic in, or one that we've talked about is don't feel. And so when we remove the addiction from the family, people start to feel, and it's intense. So give yourself some time and assess your own readiness for change. Let me reiterate, assess your own readiness for change, not your loved one, not your spouse's, your own. So the readiness for change is pre-contemplation, which means you're not even thinking about it. Contemplation, you're thinking about it. Preparation means you're getting ready to do something about it. Action is doing something about it. And then maintenance is maintaining that change. So when you think about your own readiness for change, where are you with it? There will be a lot of anxiety and frustration that comes along with other people not being on the same page as you. So only focusing on your own readiness for change and recognizing that other people aren't going to be where you are. And that's really okay, right? And then practicing a lot of self-compassion. It is natural to resist looking inward and focusing on yourself. It's easier to point your finger at someone else and say, well, this is what's wrong with them, and they're not ready for change, and they don't have emotional intelligence. And so when you start to do those kind of exercises and exploring your own readiness for change, you will resist it and it will be uncomfortable. So the practice of self-compassion is thinking about, if you were your own best friend or your best friend were going through this, how would you treat them or how would you support them? And being able to do that for yourself. For a lot of people, they can't do it for themselves. So I encourage them to ask for help while they're learning how to be kind to themselves. Phone a friend, find a therapist, go to an Al-Anon group, which is a 12-step recovery community for family members. And then last is related to our discussion on roles. Dictate your own role and don't let your role dictate you. So I have a question that's really good in the chat, which is, what if a family member refuses any kind of therapy or rehab, etc.? So if you think about the concept of the whole system, right? So you are a part of that system. Focusing on your own therapy or treatment, etc., will start to change the whole system, because as you get healthier, your relationship with the person experiencing addiction or your spouse, they will change. And so again, you cannot dictate someone else's readiness for change. All you can do is talk about your own and work on your own recovery plan, which we're going to get into, I believe, the next slide. Good question, though. Oops. Okay, so I couldn't figure out a way to get this to come up one at a time. So I'm going to break down what this table is. This is a recovery plan for, it's an example of what we do for people that are experiencing substance use, and then how we translate that to a family member's recovery plan. So this first line is a person experiencing substance use disorder. Number one, define your own recovery. For people experiencing substance use, it's also like really common that they're trying to abstain from drugs and alcohol, and they want to establish their own recovery plan. And then we're going to ask those people that are suffering with addiction, what are your high risk for relapse? You need to think about it. Oftentimes it's old people, places, things, free time, holidays, I got this attitude, or if they're withdrawing or isolating, those are going to be their high risk for relapse. And then we make a list with them of their favorite coping skills that they know work, and then we provide a bunch of resources for them. This is something that the person suffering from addiction does on their own, right? We cannot dictate their own recovery, their recovery plan. So for the family members, we are going to define our own recovery. And that looks like the whole list of dynamics, right? We don't want to engage in our active addiction dynamics. Instead, we want to abstain from co-alcoholism or being a co-alcoholic, which just means we don't want to be the enabler. We don't want to assume responsibilities. We don't want to minimize or deny. We don't want to rationalize or splint any part of the active addiction. And so these, again, are going to be the unspoken dynamics that we participate in the active addiction system. And then we're going to think about our own risks for relapse. And for relapse, for family members, it means that we are going back to the idea that I can fix this, I caused this, or I can control or manage it, because we can't. So that's going to be something that if we notice we're doing that, that means we are on a slippery slope for our own relapse. If we become obsessively thinking about our loved one's relapse, right? Or we're obsessively thinking about their drug or alcohol use, we have this fear and anxiety, that's going to be a sign for our own relapse. If we start rescuing other people, taking that responsibility, or putting other people before ourselves in our own recovery, that's going to be a high risk for our relapse, right? And then in the same exact parallel way, I ask family members to tell me their coping skills, and we work on practicing those. And in the same exact way, I refer family members to their own treatment sometimes if they need it, a therapist, right? A psychiatrist, self-help groups. A lot of family members like to tell their loved ones, you need to go to an AA meeting. And I do this in our family workshop. I say, you need to go to an AA meeting. And I point at them and I say, next time you do that, visualize yourself pointing at that person, and then look at the other fingers pointing right back at you, and turn it around and say, I need to go to a self-help meeting. And what those are for family members, there's a lot. Family members have Al-Anon meetings. Family members can go to Refuge Recovery, Smart Recovery, Celebrate Recovery. There's a whole host of self-help meetings that are often free and amazing. And then we've got sober coaches or life coaches, and then community support. So this is what a recovery plan looks like for a family member and for a person in recovery. And so I encourage you to build this for yourself. Some more solution. This is from a book that my professors wrote that I really kind of changed the way that I think about recovery, because it can be applied to family members and people suffering with addiction. It's called 6 Essentials to Lasting Recovery. And so thinking about each of these concepts in your own recovery plan. So how do you find hope, which is, they describe it as reawakening after despair, and recognizing it doesn't have to be like this. How do you develop your own identity, because in active addiction, so long that becomes our identity. Who are you outside of this? You're not just the mother of an addict. You are a bookworm, and you are an amazing gardener, and you cook amazing meals. Who are you outside of that? We each have to have our own healthy coping skills. What works for me will not work for you or the next person. And so really kind of honing in on what those are for us, how to actively do that. And then we want to work on increasing our capacity for meaningful relationships. So often I work with families that they want to keep everything in the family system. They're focused on supporting the system. And a big part of the work that I do is getting them to understand that the system is where the problem lives. And so it can be really helpful and in a lot of ways necessary for you to build that outside relationship and support. The outside friends, support groups, whatever they are, will help keep you accountable, because in the system, remember, our tendency is to go back to homeostasis, and those outside people can help kind of keep us from sliding back. How do you identify your own sense of achievement and accomplishment? It is possible to move beyond addiction towards your own personal achievement. And then reclamation of agency, which is differentiations. You do have choices in your own behaviors, and so does your loved one. And yeah, this is the book, 6 Essentials to Lasting Recovery by Tom Kimball, Sterling Shumway. Highly recommend it. It's an easy read. It's short. You don't have to be a bookworm to pick it up and power through it. All right. So I got time. So if you do have questions or comments, please take a minute to put them in the comment box and I can speak to them. But just to summarize while you do that, key points. Every part of the family system suffers from the addiction disease. The book is called 6 Essentials to Lasting Recovery. Someone asked that in the chat. And each of us in the family system participates in dynamics that establish and maintain active addiction. And we each have an important role in family recovery, and we should all have our own recovery plans. So I hope that you've enjoyed this presentation. I know it's short and sweet, and I am super grateful for Aaron and Rebecca and NAMI Central Texas for having me. I like we mentioned at the beginning, if you do need detox or inpatient or outpatient treatment options, My friend Julie Moss is an amazing person. She can help hook you up. And then here's my contact information. If you want to email me, I'd be happy to send you the slides. I don't have handouts per se, but I will gladly share these slides with you. Just shoot me an email at my email address right here. Thank you for all the very nice comments.
Allie, there is a question in the Q&A box for you.
Let's see. How well do the concepts of this, I'm getting a lot of presentation, generalize to other addictive disorders such as sex and love addiction, compulsive gambling, compulsive eating? Are there notable differences that would appear in applying this framework to other addictive disorders, aside from just seeking different support groups? Raven, amazing question. So what you're talking about are what we call process addictions, which are the way that we describe those is that there's not usually like a drug or alcohol, but there is the same exact addictive process. And so in a lot of ways, these concepts of recovery and these concepts of family dynamics do present in process addictions. For the most part, I would say they easily translate with very little tweaking. And I would say that there aren't really many notable differences in talking about recovery dynamics. So Raven, if you'd like, there is a really good paper by Dr. Kitty Harris and Sarah Smock Jordan on recovery resilience, I believe it's what it's called. If you want to email me, I can send you the paper. But it outlines the process of addiction and the process of recovery, and you can plug in any chemical dependency or any process addiction and see that they are very parallel. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you, Raven. That was a really good question. Yeah, Katrina asked a similar question. So yes, it can apply for process addictions. Any specific books for teenagers suffering from addiction? Valerie, if you want to email me, I can't think of any off the top of my head. My specialty is working with adults, but I know some people that do specialize in working with teenagers I could connect you with. All right, let's see. Do you think families can realistically engage in self-help, or do you recommend that an external entity be involved, at least as an observer, if not the driver? I do believe that family members can realistically engage in self-help. And I do highly recommend that external entities be involved. I think external support for a lot of families is a game changer. And when I work with families, I really push them to develop those external support systems, whether it's an Al-Anon group or a church group, or I've worked with, I'm thinking of a mom that it was her book club. And so whatever those external entities, whatever is available, I highly recommend people using that. Yes, this presentation will be recorded. I believe Rebecca said that it'll be on the NAMI Central Texas Mind Matters website. So if you want to return to the website where you registered, I think that's where it'll live. The recording will live. Okay, we're 2 minutes out. I've got one more question. I'll answer that, and then I will, if you have follow-up thoughts, you're welcome to email me. So when divorce is being considered as a result of addiction, is this considered the fatal stage of addiction? I think that that's a really good question. In some ways, the relationship could be dying or could be experiencing death. But divorce doesn't always necessarily mean that the relationship ends for some people. For some people, it's just a change in the relationship structure. And so I would encourage you, yeah, to really kind of think more on that. And if you work with a therapist, and yeah, I think to answer your question shortly, it doesn't have to be considered fatal, but for some people it might be. And yeah, that's okay. All right, so we are on time. Thank you again to everyone. Thank you, Julie, and my therapy team for being here and supporting me, and Aaron and Rebecca and NAMI Central Texas for hosting.
Thank you, Dr. Ali, for your wonderful presentation. And I just want to thank everybody for your time this morning with us. And also just to remind you to save the date for March 17th, because that presentation will be on youth mental health by Austin Child Guidance Center. And we'll keep you posted about our February Mind Matters presentation as well. So we hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much.